Hola a todos, bienvenidos a este espacio. En esta ocasión les traigo la primera parte del diálogo entre el Dr. John Lennox y Alex O'Connor. Sin duda un diálogo que teníamos tiempo y esperando. El Dr. John Lennox es uno de los catedráticos o académicos cristianos más importantes de estos últimos tiempos. Es un hombre que es digno de imitar, no solamente por su capacidad intelectual, pero sino por la decencia y la forma de entablar diálogos con las personas. Y que en esta ocasión nos traen el tema la ciencia y la fe. Así que veamos esta primera parte.
Are science and religion in conflict?
I don't really think so. And I've had that impression actually for a very long time, in the sense that when I was at school, I started reading C.S. Lewis. My father gave me some of his books. And it was very interesting reading those books because his take on the history of science, which was based on Alfred North Whitehead actually, was, to quote more or less, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. That fascinated me. And a little bit more research showed me that if you take modern science, I'm not talking about medieval science, modern science, and you start with people like Galileo, and then you move on to Kepler, Newton, and so on. These people were all believers in God with slight variations on it. And it seemed to me there was a pretty close connection between their theism and their approach to science. And in general, historians of science, and when I came to Oxford after a while, I worked for a time with John Hedley Brooke, who was the first professor of science and religion here, a wonderful historian.
Yeah.
And he was very cautious, but he said there certainly does seem to be a connection between the biblical worldview and the rise of modern science. So sometimes I say to people who ask me that question that I'm not remotely ashamed of being a scientist, if you count mathematicians as scientists, and a Christian, because arguably it was the Judeo-Christian worldview that gave me my subject. So I think there's a deep resonance there. And I do think there is a conflict, though, just to explain a little bit further, but it's not between science and faith in God. And I often illustrate this by thinking of the Nobel Prize in Physics. Because, take for example, Peter Higgs, who won it, Scotsman, atheist, brilliant physicist. And then there's another person I know, Bill Phillips, an American Nobel Prize winner for physics and a Christian. And what that tells me, Alex, really is this, that their difference isn't in the realm of physics at all, or science, it's in worldview. And I see a real conflict between the theistic worldview and the atheistic worldview, and there are scientists on both sides. And so I feel that if we take that on board, we can make a more sensible exploration of this whole, well, I think it's a myth, and a lot of historians do as well, that science and religion are necessarily in conflict. I think as a final codicil, I would say it depends what religion you're talking about. I'm talking about the Judeo-Christian worldview, because science conflicts with a lot of religions.
I think this question of the history of science,
Yes,
and it being tied up with the Christian worldview is an interesting one, because to me it's slightly different to asking whether the findings of science after the scientific method gets off the ground conflict with the sort of tenets of religious belief. And so I think what a lot of people will think is, okay, the founders of the scientific method were Christian, but of course they were, because everyone was Christian. And if science does somehow undermine Christianity, then of course they would be Christians, because they hadn't invented the scientific method yet to undermine it. And so people will point to the findings of science and say that the explanatory power that these Christian men who wanted to understand the universe found in the scientific method removes the space needed for the explanatory power of God. Now, I know you disagree with that too, of course, but I was hoping you could tell us why.
Well, I think it is an argument that's pretty fair if you apply it to a limited proportion of the earth.
Yep.
But the interesting thing to me about that, and I've thought about it a fair bit because it's the obvious point to make, and it's a good point to make, is that modern science did not develop among the Chinese. And a lot of study was done on that particular topic by a very famous sinologist who actually, did he found the Academy of Sciences in China? I'm wrestling for his name. You probably know it.
I'm not sure I do.
But he did a lot of research, and he was principally a Marxist in his viewpoint.
Mhm.
And that is what makes his conclusion very interesting. He certainly was the author of a massive dictionary of scientific science and all that. He tried to explain within a Marxist framework why modern science of the type you described
Right.
didn't arise in China. And the conclusion he came to was it was a difference in a fundamental presupposition of the idea that there was a unification in the sense that there was one creator who had created the universe and created the human mind to study it. And the Chinese didn't have that. That was his view. So it seems to me that that is an interesting response to this. If you take the whole world, modern science arose in a particular place, in a particular time, where, in a sense, the general background was Christian. But on the other hand, it didn't arise where the general background was very different. So I think that's how I would respond to it.
So 2 questions come to mind for me. One is the question of the so-called golden age of the Islamic world, with particular
Yes.
reference to mathematics,
Yes.
which will make people think, okay, science arises in the Christian West, but we also have this rich tradition of
We
science
do.
and discovery
That's
within Islam
absolutely
as
right.
well. And the extent to which you said it depends which religion you're talking about, I wondered if you had a view on whether Islam can be similarly credited with scientific
think-
knowledge.
I'm not an expert at Islam, but I used to be very interested in what went on in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad,
Mhm.
where a lot of work was done, and some of it by Christians, by the way, working away at translating some of the more ancient classical documents into languages that were available to people around. And at the very least, in the Islamic tradition, you have a very strong transmission of more ancient texts. That, of course, helped with the advance of modern science.
Mhm.
But as far as I know, not a great deal of innovation. But I'd put, again, I would say my field is algebra, and the word algebra comes from al-jabr, which is an Arabic word. And in the Islamic world, you had tremendous understanding of observational astronomy and their ways of solving equations and so on, and back into the Babylonian world. So we had certainly a great deal of stuff that was transmitted forward and helped. I would say helped enormously. But in the sort of innovation and experimentation and all this kind of thing, and the vast steps forward taken by people like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, they didn't get that far, but we must credit them.
The other question that came to mind then is one concerning the difference between, say, belief in God as motivating your
Yes.
scientific enterprise and Christianity as a world religion. Because
Yes.
when I think about someone like Galileo, an important founder of the scientific method, and I think about the way that he's treated by the reigning Catholic authorities for presenting an alternate view of the world, although not proving it, arguably, at the time, running into a bit of trouble and ending up finishing his life in house arrest in Tuscany.
Rather luxurious house
Yeah,
arrest,
it's quite.
actually.
He got it quite well. I think this idea that he was tortured for his beliefs is a mistaken one, although allegedly some people believe that he was shown the instruments of torture, as if to say,
that could be.
keep
Well,
quiet.
Here again, I think that using Galileo as an example
Mhm.
doesn't work, because if you look at what actually happened, the first people to criticize Galileo was not the Catholic Church. It was the philosophers
Mm.
who were building on Aristotle and believed in a fixed earth. And the church got involved rather foolishly because it had climbed on the Aristotelian bandwagon.
Yes.
So you could argue that this is not really science versus Christianity, because Galileo was a Christian. He believed in God before he started all this and when he finished. So I think I would agree with the historians of science that say that the Galileo incident is not really one to be used to show that there's a huge conflict between science and religion.
Yes.
I think the book Galileo's Daughter is well worth reading on this story. And Galileo was a bit silly, you know, and unwise in what he did. He insisted, first of all, on writing in Italian, and that irritated the experts who thought everything should be done in Latin.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, he wrote a text and put the views of the then Pope, who had been his friend, into the mouth of a character he named Simplicio,
Yes.
the fool. And as for PR, I think he comes fairly near a zero.
Yeah,
actually.
And he'd been told by the Catholic Church not to write about heliocentrism, but there was some dispute over what he was allowed to do. And so he writes this philosophical dialogue where he's like, well, I'm not writing an essay in favor of heliocentrism. I'm writing a dialogue. It's just that the character that disagrees with me is called the fool. And that's what finally did it seems, for the church. For me, I think you're right to say that this isn't a good indication of the conflict between science and religious belief. For me, at best, with the most sort of uncharitable view of the Catholic practice here, it might show a conflict between, say, the scientific method of Galileo and the Catholic Church. But I want to very carefully tease apart the historical question of like world religions and their potential suppression of the scientific method with the more specific point I think you're making, which is about the personal belief in an ordered universe as being necessary to engage in science.
I think that's fair enough. And if you look at various times in church history, I would say that to their shame, and as in the Galileo case, it was only in my lifetime that the Catholic Church rehabilitated Galileo.
Yes.
And that's pretty shameful.
Finally said that he was correct.
Yes. And the same is true, I suppose, of the so-called conflict between Huxley and Wilberforce, you know, after Darwin.
Yes.
That again, that's represented as a...
This is a debate that happens just down the road at the Natural History Museum
here, the Natural History
in Oxford,
Museum. And
it's between Thomas Huxley, who is a sort of protege of Charles Darwin.
Yes.
And so the newly discovered idea of natural selection is being defended by Huxley, and then you've got the Bishop Wilberforce who is arguing against it. And this is again seen as archetypal science, evolution, undeniable fact, versus
that's right.
the priest that can't accept it.
But it's very interesting. I've read the whole debate, and I find that many people haven't. And Wilberforce was the kind of cleric who was an amateur scientist. And he seemed to have a lot of leisure for doing that, which might tell us something about the church in those days.
Right.
And Huxley was dead against this. He wanted a professional class of scientists. That's the first. There was a strong bias against it. But when it came to the argument, I was fascinated to discover that very early on in his speech, Wilberforce said, I am not going to use religious arguments.
Mm.
I am only going to discuss the science. That's often left completely out of the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it was, what was his name? The professor of the history of science at the Open University said that this event should not be used to drive a wedge between science and Christianity. It was a much more complex thing. It was a sociological thing as well.
Yeah.
The push to have professional scientists get rid of the clerics, turn the churches into temples to Sophia, the goddess of wisdom, and all this kind of stuff. There was much more going on than simply dealing with science. But poor old Wilberforce, I think he gets the rough end of the stick, and it's not always very accurate.
I mean, instinctively, I think of people who are motivated by their religious beliefs,
Yes,
but so as to convince the non-religious,
yes.
will abandon that as a strategy of argumentation and say, well, look, I'm not going to rely on my religious views here to convince you.
Yeah.
And yet that is still their motivation to presenting these arguments. And I really don't know when I say, like,
Well,
I don't know what you suspect Wilberforce's motivation was, or if there's anything else that indicates that he really
Well, you're
was
right.
just a science
I take from
enthusiast.
what you're saying that it's always difficult to second guess motivation
Yes.
and to understand what it is. And we can only see that what I find actually interesting is that Wilberforce, it actually occurred to him to say what kind of argument he was using. I thought that was pretty insightful of Wilberforce, in spite of the fact that generations afterwards, nobody took any notice of it. He was actually passionate about the science and felt a case could be rested on the science alone. That's an attitude I like.
Y bueno, a manera de resumen sobre esta primera parte entre Alex O'Connor y John Lennox, Alex nos sugiere que la ciencia podría hacer innecesario a Dios. Lennox responde diciendo que no hay conflicto. La ciencia moderna nació de una visión cristiana y el problema real es entre cosmovisiones, teísta y atea. ¿Por qué en el Occidente cristiano? Alex dice que los científicos eran cristianos porque realmente todos lo eran en Europa en ese entonces. Lennox responde que la idea de un Dios de orden marcó la diferencia, algo que por ejemplo no ocurrió en China, marcada por una cosmovisión atea. Y la Edad de Oro Islámica, Alex destaca aportes como el álgebra. Lennox reconoce su labor preservando conocimiento, pero dice que las innovaciones claves realmente surgieron en Europa. Alex usa el clásico ejemplo de Galileo como choque entre la ciencia y la fe, pero Lennox aclara que fue más político y que Galileo era un hombre cristiano. Y finalmente concluyen con el histórico debate de Wilberforce. Alex lo ve como un claro ejemplo de conflicto entre estas disciplinas. Sin embargo, Lennox nos dice que Wilberforce usó la ciencia misma y que no fue tan simple como muchos lo catalogan. ¿Qué opinan? Dejen sus comentarios y nos vemos en la siguiente parte de este video.